Marietta Lambert pulled her car to a stop at the edge of Saint Solange, the forgotten town nestled deep within the Louisiana bayou. Her skin prickled as she stepped out, the oppressive humidity wrapping around her like a wet blanket. The silence was thick, unnatural. No birds, no insects, just an eerie quiet that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The town, long abandoned, felt like a relic left to rot in the swamp, its dilapidated buildings sagging under the weight of time. Spanish moss hung from trees like the tattered remnants of ghosts, swaying lazily in the slight breeze. But it wasn't just the town's decay that unnerved her. It was the feeling of being watched. Every step she took seemed to draw unseen eyes from the shadows, tracking her movements, waiting. Marietta's instincts told her to leave, to get back into her car and drive away from this forsaken place. But she had a job to do. An investigative journalist on the hunt for a story, she had come to Saint Solange chasing whispers of a curse, one tied to a string of mysterious disappearances and dark voodoo practices. It was said that the entire population had vanished in a single night, leaving behind nothing but bloodstains and eerie tales of vengeful spirits. But what really brought her here was the diary. An anonymous package had arrived at her office weeks ago, containing a weathered journal. The last few entries were written by a woman named Amara, who had lived in Saint Solange before the town was wiped from the map. Amara had been a practitioner of voodoo, and her final words hinted at something unspeakable, something that had gone terribly wrong during a ritual. It was these last entries that sent chills down Marietta's spine. They are restless. They whisper from the shadows. The sleeping shadows, once dormant, now hunger for souls, and I fear I have awakened them. Whoever reads this, beware. They are coming for you too. Marietta wasn't one to believe in ghost stories or curses, but something about the diary felt different. The urgency in Amara's words was palpable, the fear real. And that was enough to drive Marietta to this desolate place, chasing a lead that no one else dared to follow. She walked through the overgrown streets, her footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The town looked as though it had been frozen in time, doors left open, windows shattered, furniture still inside the homes as though the inhabitants had fled in a hurry. There were no signs of life, only decay. It was as if the very soul of Saint Solange had been ripped away, leaving behind a husk of its former self. Her eyes fell on the town's small church, a crumbling stone building with its front doors hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. The diary had mentioned a ritual that had taken place there, the last act of desperation to stop the shadows. Marietta felt drawn to it, her curiosity overriding her fear. The church was even worse on the inside. The pews were covered in a thick layer of dust, and strange symbols were scratched into the stone walls, symbols that matched those in Amara's diary. An altar stood at the center, stained with something dark and dried, though she dared not think of what it could be. And then she saw it, a small leather-bound book lying on the floor near the altar, almost as if it had been waiting for her. Marietta knelt down, her fingers brushing over the brittle pages as she picked it up. The cover was worn, but inside the handwriting was eerily familiar. It was Amara's diary, the original one. The one she had received in the mail had been a copy. As she flipped through the pages, the entries became more frantic, more desperate. They whisper from the shadows. I hear them in my sleep. The ritual was supposed to bind them, to send them back into the darkness from where they came. But I fear we failed. Her heart raced as she reached the final page. The words were scrawled in shaky handwriting, as though the author had been in a hurry. They are here. They have awoken. Whoever finds this, know that the sleeping shadows will not stop until they consume every last soul. You cannot escape. They are coming for you. Marietta's breath hitched in her throat. The words blurred on the page as her mind raced. This was no ordinary superstition. The people of Saint Solange hadn't simply vanished. They had been taken by something far worse than she had imagined. Her pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin. She stood, clutching the diary, when a soft whisper cut through the silence like a knife. Marietta. Her heart stopped. The voice was faint, almost carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. Someone, something, was calling her name. She turned sharply, scanning the empty church, but there was no one there. Her mind raced, desperately trying to rationalize the sound. But then she heard it again, louder this time, closer. Marietta. A cold hand of dread gripped her as she stumbled backward. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, twisting and contorting, forming shapes that shouldn't exist. Something moved in the darkness beyond the altar, something watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Her instincts screamed at her to leave. She ran out of the church, her breath coming in shallow gasps. As she made her way back through the empty streets, the feeling of being watched never left her. The eyes, those invisible eyes, followed her every step. But worse than the eyes were the whispers. "They are coming for you," they said. "They are coming." Marietta ran. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the town, her car just in sight. But even as she slammed the door and sped away from Saint Solange, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her, that the curse wasn't bound to the town alone, but to her now too. The diary lay open on the passenger seat beside her, and in the rearview mirror she thought she saw a flicker of movement in the back seat, a shadow just for a moment before it vanished. Marietta was no longer an outsider to the curse of Saint Solange. Now she was a part of it. The drive out of Saint Solange should have calmed her. It should have made her feel safe, but it didn't. The farther Marietta got from the decaying town, the stronger the sense of dread grew inside her. She could still feel it, that dark, suffocating presence. No matter how fast she drove, no matter how far she went, something was following her. She tried to convince herself it was just nerves, that the eerie atmosphere of the abandoned town had gotten under her skin. The mind plays tricks on you when you're scared. But deep down, she knew better. The whispers, the shadows, they weren't just figments of her imagination. The diary had warned her after all. Amara's final words echoed in her head like a sinister refrain. "They are coming for you." Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel. She had planned to go back to her hotel, review the notes she had taken, and decide what to do next. But now she wasn't so sure. A heavy weight pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The further she drove, the more the road seemed to stretch endlessly, as if Saint Solange wasn't letting her go, wasn't letting her escape. By the time she reached the hotel, the sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into darkness. She parked and sat in her car for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see a shadowy figure sitting in the back seat. But there was nothing. Just the dim light from the hotel's flickering neon sign. "You're imagining things," she whispered to herself. "It's just your mind playing tricks." But the chill that ran down her spine told her otherwise. She stepped out of the car, grabbed her bag, and hurried into her room, locking the door behind her with shaking hands. The silence in the room was oppressive, heavy. She flicked on the lights, checking every corner, every shadow, even inside the bathroom and closet. Nothing. She was alone. Or so it seemed. Marietta collapsed onto the bed, trying to catch her breath. Her body ached with exhaustion, but sleep felt impossible. Her mind was racing, replaying every eerie moment from the town, the blood-stained altar, the voodoo effigies, the unsettling diary, and those eyes, the eyes she had felt on her, watching her from the dark corners of Saint Solange. She hadn't seen them, not clearly, but she had felt them. She was sure of it. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She reached over, expecting a message from her editor or a colleague, but the screen was blank. Another buzz, this time louder. A notification? Number. The sound wasn't coming from her phone. Her heart lurched as she sat up, scanning the room. The buzz came again, this time from somewhere behind her. Slowly, she turned, eyes widening in horror. On the small desk near the window, the leather-bound diary lay open, its pages fluttering as if stirred by an unseen breeze. She had left the diary in the car. A cold wave of dread washed over her. She approached the diary cautiously, her pulse quickening with each step. The pages had flipped to a new entry, one she hadn't seen before. The ink looked fresh, the handwriting jagged and rushed, as though scrawled in a moment of panic. The eyes never leave. They watch from the shadows, waiting. They are always watching. Marietta stumbled back, her throat tightening with fear. How was this possible? No one else had touched the diary. No one else had been in her room. But even as her mind scrambled for an explanation, something else grabbed her attention. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement, just a flicker, like a ripple in the air. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head toward the corner of the room. At first, there was nothing, just shadows pooling in the corners, thick and dark. But then, there, something moved within the darkness, a faint glimmer like the reflection of light in an animal's eyes. The unseen eyes. They were here. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she backed away, her gaze locked on the shifting shadows. The air in the room seemed to thicken, growing heavy and dense, pressing down on her. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, like something was breathing in the dark, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" Marietta's voice trembled as she spoke, though she knew she would get no answer. The shadows didn't speak. They watched, always watching. A sudden cold gust swept through the room, rattling the windows. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the room into complete darkness. Panic surged through her, and she scrambled for her phone, the only source of light. She turned on the flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the dark like a lifeline. But the light didn't help. There, in the beam's path, were eyes, gleaming red eyes, staring at her from the far side of the room. Marietta's breath hitched in her throat, her hands shaking as the flashlight beam wavered. The eyes blinked, then disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. But she knew they hadn't gone far. They were still there, just beyond the light, watching her every move. With trembling hands, she fumbled for her bag and grabbed the diary. Her instincts screamed at her to leave the room, but something deep inside her whispered that running wouldn't help. Whatever this was, it wasn't bound to the room. It had followed her from Saint Solange, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. Her mind raced, searching for answers, for a way out. The diary. Amara had mentioned the eyes, the watching ones. There had to be something in the diary that could help her, some way to break free of the curse. Frantically, she flipped through the pages, stopping at one of the earliest entries. The eyes are the harbingers. They see what the sleeping shadows cannot. They hunt for them. If you see the eyes, it is already too late. Marietta's heart sank. The eyes weren't just watching, they were hunting her. For the sleeping shadows. And if what the diary said was true, her time was running out. The whispers started again, low and guttural, coming from all around her. They seemed to rise from the floor, from the walls, from the very shadows themselves. Her chest tightened as the temperature dropped, her breath coming out in short, visible puffs. Suddenly, a sharp knock at the door broke through the whispers. Marietta nearly jumped out of her skin. The sound was so out of place, so jarringly normal, that for a brief moment she wondered if she had imagined it. But the knock came again, louder this time. With the flashlight still in her hand, she approached the door cautiously, heart pounding in her chest. She hesitated, then opened the door just a crack, enough to see out into the dimly lit hallway. There was no one there. Only the long, empty corridor stretching out in both directions, silent and still. She scanned the hall, but it was empty. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. And then, as she began to close the door, she saw them again. Those red, glowing eyes, hovering just at the edge of the shadows near the far end of the hall. They were waiting for her. Marietta slammed the door shut and locked it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She pressed her back against the door, her mind racing. The eyes were everywhere now, and there was no escaping them. They weren't going to stop until they had her. Marietta's nerves were frayed, each heartbeat sending a jolt of panic through her body. The feeling of being watched had become unbearable. The unseen eyes followed her every move, their presence heavy in every corner of the room. She couldn't escape them. They were always there, waiting, watching her with silent, patient hunger. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, the visions returned. The altar, the dolls, the symbols etched into the stone walls of the Saint Solange church, and the terrible glowing eyes that burned in the dark. In her dreams, she was back there, bound to that altar, helpless as a shadowy figure stood over her, chanting in a language she could not understand. The sense of dread grew each day. Whatever was following her wasn't just watching anymore, it was getting closer. She could feel it, a malevolent presence tightening around her like a noose. On the third night, Marietta woke with a start, her breath caught in her throat. The room was ice cold, her breath clouding in front of her as if she were trapped inside a freezer. The whispers were louder than ever, swelling around her like a chorus of disembodied voices. Sacrifice. 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 The word echoed in her mind, sharp and insistent. Her heart pounded as she sat up, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows were alive, twisting and writhing, as though they were reaching out for her. She knew what the whispers meant. The ritual she had read about in Amara's diary, the one meant to banish the sleeping shadows, it had required a sacrifice. But the ritual had failed. She grabbed the diary from the bedside table and flipped frantically through the pages. The handwriting became more erratic as Amara's story progressed, her words dripping with fear and desperation. Amara had tried to complete the ritual, but something had gone horribly wrong. The townspeople had vanished, consumed by the very forces they sought to banish. The sleeping shadows had been awakened, hungry for souls, and they would not rest until the ritual was completed. And now, the burden had fallen on Marietta. "They need a soul," Amara had written. "The sacrifice must be made to seal the shadows away. But the shadows are cunning. They will not take just anyone. They choose, they follow, they hunt." Marietta's stomach turned. The sacrifice wasn't just a random person. The eyes, the watching ones, they were choosing her. She was the one they wanted. Despair clawed at her as she paced the room, her thoughts spiraling into chaos. How could she possibly escape this? Every step she had taken since entering Saint Solange had brought her closer to this moment. The curse had latched onto her, pulling her deeper into its web. There was no running from it. The only way out was through. But did it have to be her? A flicker of hope sparked in her chest as a dangerous idea began to take shape in her mind. The diary had said the sleeping shadows needed a soul, but it didn't specify whose soul. Could she offer someone else? Could she outsmart whatever dark force was stalking her and find another way to complete the ritual without losing her own life? Marietta's thoughts raced as she considered the possibilities. She needed to act fast before the shadows claimed her. That's when she remembered Jeremy. Jeremy Ward, a fellow journalist, had been tailing her since the beginning of this story. At first, she had thought it was a coincidence, two reporters chasing the same lead, but then she realized he had been following her too closely. He had tried to undermine her, attempted to steal her research. It wouldn't be hard to convince him to meet up. He still thought he could profit off her work. Marietta's hands shook as she texted him. "Need to talk. Meet me at the old church in Saint Solange tomorrow at dusk. I have what you're looking for." She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the send button. Her heart raced, knowing what she was about to do. If this worked, she could make Jeremy the sacrifice. The sleeping shadows would take him, and she would be free. She hit send. The next day arrived with an ominous sense of finality. The drive back to Saint Solange felt like a funeral procession, the road twisting through the dense trees like a snake, leading her to an inevitable fate. The closer she got to the town, the heavier the air became, thick with moisture and the lingering stench of decay. By the time she reached the church, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting everything in a deep, bloody red. Jeremy was already there, leaning against the crumbling stone wall, a smug grin on his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had outplayed her. He was wrong. "Glad you could make it," Jeremy called out, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "So, you ready to share what you've got? Or are we going to keep dancing around this?" Marietta approached him slowly, her hands hidden in the pockets of her jacket. "I found something," she said, her voice low and measured. "Something bigger than we thought." Jeremy's eyes gleamed with greed. "I knew it. Knew you were holding out on me." She led him inside the church, her stomach twisting in knots as they entered the darkened space. The familiar symbols were still etched into the stone walls, the altar still stained with old blood. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, watching, waiting. "I want to show you something," Marietta said, leading him to the altar. "It's part of a ritual, something the people of Saint Solange were involved in before they disappeared." Jeremy followed her, oblivious to the dark energy building in the room. He had no idea what was coming. "This place gives me the creeps," Jeremy muttered, glancing around. "You sure about this?" Marietta nodded, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "There's something I need you to help me with. Just stand there." She pointed to the spot in front of the altar. Jeremy hesitated, then shrugged. "All right, but this better be good." She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her. The diary's words echoed in her mind. "They take what you give them." With trembling hands, she pulled the effigy from her bag, the one that had been left for her in the church the last time she had been here. The crude doll, with its roughly stitched face, bore an unsettling resemblance to Jeremy. He didn't notice her holding it. His eyes were fixed on the symbols, on the altar, oblivious to the danger he was in. She whispered the incantation under her breath, her heart pounding in her chest as the words slipped from her lips. The air around them thickened, the shadows in the church growing darker, more solid. "Marietta, what the hell are you doing?" Jeremy asked, turning to face her, confusion spreading across his face. But it was too late. The air exploded with movement. The shadows surged forward, twisting and coiling like serpents, their red eyes glowing with hunger. Jeremy's scream ripped through the church as the shadows engulfed him, their tendrils wrapping around his body, pulling him toward the altar. "No!" he shouted, his voice breaking with terror. "No, Marietta, please, stop, don't." His pleas were cut off as the shadows swallowed him whole. His body convulsed once, then went limp, the darkness consuming him completely. The room fell silent. Marietta stood frozen, her breath shallow, her hands still shaking. It was done. The sacrifice had been made. The sleeping shadows had their soul. But as the shadows receded, something cold brushed against her, something that made her blood turn to ice. A whisper, soft and sinister, echoed through the empty church. "We take what you give." Marietta's heart stopped. The words were different this time, darker, more insidious. She had expected relief, freedom, but instead, the weight of dread settled even deeper into her bones. And as she stood there, staring at the spot where Jeremy had vanished, she realized with dawning horror that the curse wasn't broken. It had only just begun. The air in Saint Solange was still, unnervingly still. The kind of silence that comes after a violent storm, where the world feels unsettled, waiting for something more. Marietta stood in the center of the old church, her heart hammering in her chest, her mind a fog of terror and disbelief. The altar loomed before her, stained with the blood of those who had come before. The flickering candles cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, and the symbols, once faint, now glowed with an eerie intensity. Jeremy's scream still echoed in her ears. She could see his face in her mind, twisted in agony as the shadows devoured him. But it hadn't worked. The sacrifice hadn't freed her. Instead, the curse had dug in deeper, like a thorn twisting into her soul. The cold voice of the shadows whispered again, this time louder, more demanding. "We take what you give." They had taken Jeremy, but it wasn't enough. The darkness was still alive, writhing in the corners of the room, watching her. The eyes were back, red, glowing, unblinking, and they were all focused on her now. They had chosen her long ago, marked her as the final offering. She had tried to outsmart them, tried to cheat the ancient curse that bound the town, but the truth was inescapable. Saint Solange wanted her. The weight of the realization pressed down on Marietta, crushing her beneath its terrible certainty. She had come here searching for a story, for answers, but now she was the answer. The curse had woven itself into her life, her very soul, and there was no escaping it. Her hands trembled as she backed away from the altar, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows moved. They rippled like water, creeping toward her with an unnatural hunger. Their red eyes gleamed in the dim light, filled with an insatiable need. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat that filled her head, her whole body consumed by the primal fear of what was coming for her. But even in her terror, Marietta felt a cold clarity. She knew what had to be done. She had read Amara's final entries enough times to understand what was required. There had always been two parts to the ritual. The first was the sacrifice. The second was a willing offering, a final act of surrender to the sleeping shadows. Marietta's pulse slowed as the realization settled over her. It had always been leading to this. The curse demanded more than just a life. It demanded that she give herself to it, willingly, just as Amara had tried to do all those years ago. It was the only way to seal the shadows back into the darkness, the only way to end the suffering. Her hands felt numb as she fumbled through her bag, pulling out the effigy. The crude doll still bore her likeness, stitched with rough thread, its eyes dark and hollow. It felt heavy in her hands, a symbol of her fate, the very thing she had tried to avoid. She walked back to the altar, her legs trembling, her entire body feeling as though it were being pulled by invisible strings. The shadows surged forward, eager, impatient. She placed the effigy on the blood-stained stone, her breath catching in her throat. Her reflection flickered in the broken windows, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear and determination. The whispers in the air grew louder, the voices swirling around her like a storm, calling her closer to the brink. The final offering must be willing. Give yourself to us. Marietta hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch the effigy. The weight of the decision pressed on her, the enormity of the choice she was making. But there was no turning back now. There was no escape. The curse had claimed everyone else, and now it had claimed her. She closed her eyes. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Take me." The room exploded with sound. The shadows erupted from the walls, swirling around her in a violent storm of darkness. The candles blew out in an instant, plunging the church into a deep, suffocating blackness. The temperature plummeted, and Marietta could feel the cold seep into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. And then the eyes were there, right in front of her, close enough to feel their cold gaze on her skin. They blinked, and a voice whispered in her ear, low and insidious, "You have given yourself." The darkness wrapped around her like a shroud, pulling her deeper into its embrace. She could feel it now, the pull of the sleeping shadows, the hunger they held for her soul. It was like falling into an endless abyss, cold and terrifying, the world slipping away from her, piece by piece. But as she sank into the darkness, something strange happened. The whispers stopped. The suffocating weight on her chest lifted just slightly, and for the first time since she had entered Saint Solange, Marietta felt a faint glimmer of peace. It was over. The town was silent again, the curse complete. The sleeping shadows had what they wanted. Saint Solange could rest, her vision blurred, the edges of the world fading as the shadows claimed her, one last whisper brushing against her consciousness before she disappeared entirely. "We take what you give, but we do not let go." The words echoed in her mind as everything went dark. Marietta Lambert, the final offering, was gone. Weeks passed and the story of Marietta Lambert's disappearance began to fade, just as all stories of Saint Solange had. The town remained abandoned, forgotten by the world, the cursed history buried beneath layers of neglect and swampy decay. But the curse was not forgotten. In the quiet just before dawn, if you listened closely, you could still hear the faintest whispers in the air. A warning, or perhaps an invitation, carried on the wind for those foolish enough to listen. And if you were to venture into the heart of Saint Solange, to the old crumbling church at its center, you would find the altar still standing. You would see the symbols carved into the walls, their meaning lost to time but their power still potent. And there, on the altar, a new effigy had appeared, one that bore the face of Marietta Lambert. The eyes watched, and they waited,